Welcome to History for Snooze. Every page of history holds the footprints of time, the laughter of kitchens, the warmth of hearth fires, and the savory traditions that once nourished entire communities. Here, we will travel back to the past, slowly, gently, so we can almost smell the spices, the bread baking, and the feasts prepared for both kings and common folk. Tonight, our story drifts into the flavorful world of medieval food history, from humble meals shared by peasants, to the grand banquets of nobles, and the surprising ingredients that shaped life in the Middle Ages. These dishes reveal how people not only survived, but also celebrated life through taste, tradition, and togetherness. Before we start, dim the lights, settle into a comfortable spot, and let the world outside fade away. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Your small gesture is my greatest inspiration to keep telling these stories. And in the comments, let me know where in the world you're listening from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. Now, close your eyes and join me on this quiet journey, where history is not just a record of events, but a soft-spoken story that will guide you toward peace, and maybe even toward sleep. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 CE to the beginning of the Renaissance around 1500 CE, witnessed profound transformations in European society, politics, and culture. Among these changes, perhaps none were more intimately connected to daily life than the evolution of food habits, culinary practices, and dining customs. Medieval food culture was a complex tapestry woven from threads of necessity, availability, social status, religious belief, and emerging trade networks that would eventually reshape the known world. Understanding medieval food habits requires us to look beyond simple sustenance to examine how food functioned as a marker of social hierarchy, religious devotion, economic power, and cultural identity. From the humble porridge of peasants to the elaborate feasts of nobility, food in medieval Europe told stories of class division, seasonal rhythms, technological innovation, and the gradual expansion of global trade networks. This comprehensive examination explores the multifaceted world of medieval cuisine, investigating not only what people ate but how they ate, when they ate, and what their food choices revealed about their place in society. We will journey through the great halls of castles where elaborate banquets displayed wealth and power, into the smoky kitchens of monasteries where monks developed sophisticated preservation techniques, and down to the simple hearths of peasant cottages where families survived on whatever the land could provide. The transition from the Roman Empire to medieval Europe marked a dramatic shift in culinary culture. The Romans had developed sophisticated food systems, importing exotic spices from across their vast empire, maintaining complex urban food distribution networks, and cultivating refined dining customs that emphasized luxury and excess. The collapse of this system in the 5th and 6th centuries forced European populations to adapt to more localized, subsistence-based food systems. The breakdown of Roman trade networks meant that many exotic ingredients disappeared from European tables. Spices that had once been common in Roman cooking became rare and precious commodities. The sophisticated Roman cuisine, which had incorporated influences from across the Mediterranean and beyond, gave way to simpler, more regionally based cooking traditions that relied heavily on local ingredients and seasonal availability. This transition was not immediate or uniform across Europe. In some regions, particularly those that maintained stronger connections to Byzantine trade networks or had access to Mediterranean commerce, elements of Roman culinary sophistication persisted. However, for much of Northern and Western Europe, the early medieval period, roughly 500–1000 CE, was characterized by a return to more basic food systems centered around grain cultivation, animal husbandry, and foraging. The three-field system and agricultural revolution. The development of the three-field system during the 8th and 9th centuries represented one of the most significant agricultural innovations of the medieval period, with profound implications for food production and consumption. This system, which divided arable land into 3 sections, one planted with winter crops, one with spring crops, and one left fallow, significantly increased agricultural productivity and improved soil fertility. Under the three-field system, winter fields were typically planted with wheat or rye, providing the primary grain for bread production. Spring fields might contain oats, barley, peas, or beans, diversifying the food supply and improving nutritional balance. The fallow field allowed soil to recover while often serving as pasture for livestock, whose manure would fertilize the field for the following year's planting. This agricultural revolution had cascading effects throughout medieval society. Increased food production supported population growth, allowed for greater specialization of labor, and provided the agricultural surplus necessary to support non-food-producing classes such as clergy, nobility, and artisans. The system also influenced settlement patterns, as villages organized themselves around the collective management of three-field agriculture. The nutritional implications of the three-field system were significant. The cultivation of legumes like peas and beans provided essential proteins and improved soil nitrogen content through nitrogen fixation. This meant that medieval diets, particularly among peasants, often included more protein than might be expected, though this protein came primarily from plant rather than animal sources. Climate and its impact on medieval food systems. The medieval warm period, approximately 950–1250 CE, created favorable conditions for agriculture throughout much of Europe, contributing to population growth and economic expansion. Warmer temperatures allowed for the cultivation of crops at higher latitudes and elevations, extending growing seasons and improving yields. Vineyards flourished in England, grain cultivation expanded in Scandinavia, and overall food security improved across the continent. However, this period of climatic favor was followed by the Little Ice Age, roughly 1300 to 1700 CE, which brought cooler temperatures, shorter growing seasons, and more frequent crop failures. The transition to colder climate coincided with a series of catastrophic events, including the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 and the Black Death of 1347 to 1351, which profoundly impacted food systems and dietary habits. The Great Famine, caused by several years of cold, wet weather that ruined harvests across northern Europe, demonstrated the vulnerability of medieval food systems to climatic variation. Contemporary chronicles describe widespread hunger, with people resorting to eating bark, roots, and even cases of cannibalism. The famine revealed the thin margin of survival that characterized medieval food security and highlighted the importance of storage, preservation, and distribution systems. Climate variations also influenced food preservation and storage techniques. Colder periods required different approaches to keeping food through winter months, while warmer periods might allow for different preservation methods. The timing of harvests, the success of particular crops, and the availability of certain foods were all closely tied to climatic conditions, making medieval food culture highly sensitive to environmental change. Medieval society was rigidly hierarchical, and this hierarchy was reflected in every aspect of food culture, from the types of food consumed to the manner of consumption. The concept of the great chain of being suggested that all creation was arranged in a divine hierarchy, with God at the top, followed by angels, humans, arranged by social rank, animals, plants, and minerals. This worldview profoundly influenced medieval attitudes toward food and eating. At the apex of the human food hierarchy sat the nobility and royalty, whose tables featured the most refined and exotic foods available. These meals were not simply about nutrition but were elaborate displays of power, wealth, and cultural sophistication. Noble feasts might include multiple courses featuring game birds, roasted meats, delicate pastries, imported spices, and rare wines. The presentation was as important as the food itself, with dishes arranged to create visual spectacles that reinforced the host's status. The clergy occupied a complex position within this hierarchy. While many religious orders emphasized simplicity and abstinence, the higher clergy often lived in considerable luxury. Abbots and bishops might host feasts rivaling those of secular nobles, though religious dietary restrictions and seasonal fasting periods created unique patterns of consumption within ecclesiastical circles. Below the nobility, the emerging merchant class began to develop its own distinctive food culture during the later medieval period. Wealthy merchants, particularly in Italian city-states and northern European trading centers, could afford many luxury foods but lacked the social cachet of noble birth. Their food choices often represented attempts to emulate noble dining while also reflecting the practical concerns of commercial life. Artisans, craftsmen, and urban workers occupied the middle ranks of medieval society and had access to a more varied diet than rural peasants but far less than the wealthy classes. Their food habits were shaped by urban food markets, guild regulations, and the rhythm of craft production. Many lived in cities where they could purchase bread from professional bakers, meat from butchers, and ale from brewers, creating a more monetized food economy than existed in rural areas. At the bottom of the social hierarchy, peasants made up the vast majority of the medieval population. Their food habits were determined primarily by what they could produce on their own plots of land, supplemented by whatever they could gather from common lands or purchase in local markets. Peasant diets varied seasonally and were vulnerable to harvest failures, weather patterns, and the demands of feudal obligations. Noble feasting and conspicuous consumption. The great feasts of medieval nobility served multiple functions beyond simple sustenance. They were political events that reinforced social bonds, demonstrated wealth and power, established hierarchies among guests, and provided entertainment that could last for days. The scale and elaborateness of these events would seem extraordinary by modern standards, with some recorded feasts serving hundreds or even thousands of guests. The organization of a major noble feast required months of preparation and enormous resources. Hunting parties would be organized to provide game, skilled cooks would be hired or borrowed from other noble households, and elaborate temporary kitchens might be constructed to handle the volume of food preparation required. The logistics of feeding hundreds of people in an age without refrigeration or modern preservation techniques required careful planning and sophisticated understanding of food storage and preparation. The menu for a great feast typically consisted of multiple courses, each containing numerous dishes. A single course might include roasted meats, game birds, fish dishes, vegetable preparations, bread, and sweets. The variety was intended to impress guests and demonstrate the host's ability to command resources from across their domain and beyond. Exotic ingredients like imported spices, sugar, or rare wines might be featured prominently to showcase wealth and connections to international trade networks. The serving of food at noble feasts followed strict protocols that reinforced social hierarchies. The most honored guests would be seated closest to the host and served the choicest portions first. Different qualities of food might be served to different ranks of guests, with the highest-ranking individuals receiving the finest cuts of meat, the most elaborate preparations, and the rarest delicacies. Entertainment was an integral part of noble feasting, with musicians, storytellers, jesters, and other performers providing diversion between courses. The feast became a form of theater in which the display of food, the grandeur of service, and the quality of entertainment all contributed to the overall spectacle. These events could continue for days, particularly during important celebrations like marriages, coronations, or religious holidays. The economic impact of great feasts was substantial. A single major feast could consume resources equivalent to the annual income of many peasant families. The preparation might involve temporary employment for dozens of additional servants, the purchase of exotic ingredients from distant markets, and the consumption of animals that represented significant capital investment. These events represented one of the primary ways that nobles converted agricultural surplus into social and political capital. Peasant food culture and survival strategies. In stark contrast to noble feasting, peasant food culture was characterized by subsistence concerns, seasonal variation, and the constant challenge of food security. The majority of medieval Europeans were peasants who lived primarily on what they could produce themselves, supplemented by limited market purchases and seasonal gathering activities. The foundation of peasant diet was grain, typically consumed in the form of bread, porridge, or ale. The type of grain varied by region and social status, with wheat generally preferred but often unaffordable for the poorest. Rye, barley, and oats were more common in peasant diets, sometimes mixed together to create maslin bread. In years of poor harvest, bread might be extended with whatever was available: peas, beans, acorns, or even sawdust in desperate times. Peasant households typically maintained small plots of land for growing vegetables and herbs. These kitchen gardens provided essential nutrients and variety to the otherwise grain-heavy diet. Common vegetables included onions, leeks, cabbages, turnips, and various greens. Herbs served both culinary and medicinal purposes, with knowledge of their properties passed down through generations of peasant women who managed household food production. Animal protein in peasant diets came primarily from smaller animals that could be raised efficiently on limited resources. Chickens provided both eggs and meat, pigs could be fed on scraps and forest mast, and sheep or goats provided milk and occasional meat. Larger animals like cattle were too valuable as draft animals to be slaughtered regularly, though they might be consumed when they died naturally or became too old to work. Preservation techniques were crucial to peasant survival, as families needed to store food through winter months when fresh production was impossible. Salting, smoking, and drying were the primary methods for preserving meat and fish. Vegetables might be pickled, dried, or stored in root cellars. Grain needed to be kept dry and protected from rodents and insects. The success of these preservation efforts often determined whether a family survived the winter or faced starvation. Seasonal gatherings supplemented peasant diets, particularly during times of scarcity. Knowledge of edible wild plants, nuts, berries, and mushrooms was essential survival knowledge. Fishing in streams and ponds, when permitted by local authorities, provided additional protein. Hunting was generally forbidden to peasants, but poaching undoubtedly occurred, despite severe penalties for those caught taking game from noble lands. The rhythm of peasant eating followed agricultural and seasonal patterns. Harvest time might bring temporary abundance, while late winter and early spring often represented times of scarcity before new crops could be harvested. Peasants developed strategies for stretching food supplies during lean times, including eating foods that would normally be considered unsuitable and reducing overall consumption. Peasant food culture was also characterized by communal activities and shared knowledge. Baking might be done in communal ovens, brewing might involve neighborhood cooperation, and knowledge about food preservation, preparation, and foraging was shared among community members. These networks of cooperation were essential for survival and created social bonds that helped communities weather difficult periods. The merchant class and urban food markets. The emergence of a substantial merchant class during the High Medieval period, roughly 1000 to 1300 CE, created new patterns of food consumption that fell between the extremes of noble luxury and peasant subsistence. Wealthy merchants, particularly in Italian city-states like Venice and Florence, and in northern European trading centers like Bruges and Hamburg, developed distinctive food cultures that reflected both their economic prosperity and their position outside the traditional feudal hierarchy. Merchant food culture was characterized by access to exotic ingredients through trade networks, the ability to purchase rather than produce most food, and a tendency to use food consumption as a means of demonstrating social status. Unlike nobles who derived their status from birth and land ownership, merchants needed to establish and maintain their social position through visible displays of wealth, and food was one important avenue for such display. Urban food markets became increasingly sophisticated during the medieval period, reflecting the growing importance of towns and cities as centers of commerce and craft production. These markets provided urban dwellers with access to a variety of foods that would have been unavailable to rural populations. Professional bakers, butchers, brewers, and other food specialists developed to serve urban populations who could not produce their own food. The regulation of urban food markets was a major concern for medieval city governments. Quality control, price regulation, and the prevention of fraud were constant challenges. Guilds of food producers developed elaborate rules governing their trades, including standards for ingredients, production methods, and pricing. These regulations reflected both economic concerns and the recognition that food safety and quality were matters of public health. Urban food distribution systems became increasingly complex as cities grew larger. The provisioning of a city like Paris or London, with populations in the tens of thousands by the later medieval period, required sophisticated networks for bringing food from the surrounding countryside. This included systems for preserving and transporting perishable goods, storage facilities for grain and other staples, and market structures that could handle large volumes of daily transactions. The monetary economy that characterized urban life meant that food choices were increasingly determined by purchasing power rather than production capacity. This created new forms of social distinction based on what people could afford to buy rather than what they could produce. It also made urban populations vulnerable to price fluctuations and supply disruptions in ways that were different from the vulnerabilities faced by rural populations. The Christian Church exerted profound influence over medieval food habits through its extensive calendar of fasts, feast days, and dietary restrictions. The Church taught that the body was a vessel for the soul and that controlling bodily appetites, including hunger, was essential for spiritual development. This theological framework created a complex relationship between food consumption and religious observance that affected all levels of medieval society. The liturgical year was structured around alternating periods of feasting and fasting that gave rhythm to medieval food culture. Lent, the 40-day period before Easter, required the most extensive dietary restrictions, with prohibitions on meat, dairy products, and eggs. Other fasting periods included the 4 Ember Days, the vigils of major feast days, and various regional observances. By some calculations, medieval Christians were expected to fast for nearly half the days of the year. Fasting rules varied in their strictness and were often modified based on social status, health, age, and local customs. The wealthy might substitute expensive fish for meat during fast days, while the poor might simply reduce their overall food intake. Monks and nuns typically observed the strictest fasting regimens, while secular clergy and laypeople had more flexibility in their observance. Monasteries played a crucial role in medieval food culture, serving as centers of agricultural innovation, food preservation techniques, and culinary development. The Benedictine rule, established in the 6th century, provided detailed guidance for monastic food practices that influenced religious communities throughout Europe. Monastic communities were largely self-sufficient, producing their own food through agriculture, animal husbandry, and food processing. This self-sufficiency led to innovations in farming techniques, crop rotation, animal breeding, and food preservation. Monasteries often served as centers for agricultural experimentation and the development of new food technologies. The monastic emphasis on hospitality meant that monasteries maintained guest houses and were expected to provide food for travelers, pilgrims, and the poor. This hospitality function required sophisticated food production and storage systems capable of handling variable demand. Many monasteries developed reputations for particular food specialties, whether wines, cheeses, breads, or other products. Monastic libraries preserved and transmitted knowledge about agriculture, cooking, and nutrition through manuscript copying and compilation. Many medieval agricultural treatises and recipe collections survive because they were maintained in monastic libraries. Monks and nuns often served as medical practitioners, and their understanding of the relationship between food and health contributed to medieval nutritional knowledge. The scriptoria of monasteries produced illuminated manuscripts that provide valuable visual information about medieval food culture. Images of agricultural activities, food preparation, and dining scenes in religious manuscripts offer insights into daily food practices that complement written descriptions. Different religious orders developed distinctive food cultures reflecting their particular spiritual emphases. Cistercian monasteries, founded in the 12th century as a reform movement emphasizing poverty and simplicity, developed agricultural innovations that increased productivity while maintaining spiritual focus. Carthusian monks, following an eremitical tradition, ate more sparingly and individually than other orders. The economic activities of monasteries, including food production and processing, made them major players in medieval agricultural markets. Monastery estates often employed sophisticated management techniques and generated agricultural surpluses that were sold in regional markets. The economic success of many monasteries was built on their food production capabilities. Pilgrimage and food culture. The medieval practice of pilgrimage created unique food cultures and distribution systems that connected distant regions and facilitated cultural exchange. Major pilgrimage routes like the Camino de Santiago, the Via Francigena to Rome, and the routes to Jerusalem became networks for the transmission of food practices, ingredients, and culinary techniques. Pilgrims required food and shelter during their journeys, creating a hospitality industry that catered to their needs. Monasteries, hospices, and inns along pilgrimage routes developed specialized food services for travelers. This created standardized food practices that could be found across long distances and different cultural regions. The provisioning of pilgrim hostels required reliable food supplies and preservation techniques suitable for feeding large numbers of people with varying dietary needs and preferences. Host institutions developed efficient systems for food preparation and service that could handle the irregular flow of pilgrims throughout the year. Pilgrimage routes facilitated the exchange of food knowledge and techniques. Pilgrims from different regions would encounter unfamiliar foods and cooking methods, sometimes bringing these innovations back to their home communities. This cultural exchange contributed to the gradual homogenization of European food culture while also preserving regional distinctiveness. The economics of pilgrimage food services created specialized markets and production systems. Communities along major routes might specialize in particular foods or services for pilgrims. This could include the production of portable foods suitable for long journeys, specialized cooking equipment, or distinctive local foods that became associated with particular pilgrimage destinations. Religious festivals and feast days associated with pilgrimage sites created seasonal food cultures that reflected the rhythm of religious observance. Major feast days might bring thousands of pilgrims to a single location, requiring massive temporary food service operations. These events created opportunities for cultural exchange and the development of festival food traditions. Northern European food culture during the medieval period was shaped by harsh climates, shorter growing seasons, and agricultural systems adapted to cooler, wetter conditions. The food habits of England, Scotland, Scandinavia, northern France, and Germanic regions reflected these environmental constraints while also demonstrating remarkable adaptations to local conditions. In England, the medieval diet was built around grains, primarily wheat in the south and barley and oats in the north. Bread was the staff of life, consumed at every meal by all social classes, though the quality varied dramatically based on social status. White wheat bread was a luxury item, while the poor consumed darker breads made from rye, barley, or mixtures of grains. Ale was the common beverage, consumed by adults and children alike due to concerns about water quality. The English countryside provided abundant opportunities for raising livestock, and meat consumption was higher in England than in many other European regions. Beef, pork, mutton, and poultry were all consumed regularly by those who could afford them. The practice of keeping large herds of cattle for dairy production led to the development of distinctive English cheeses, and the abundance of pasture land supported sheep farming that provided both wool for export and meat for domestic consumption. Scandinavian food culture was characterized by preservation techniques adapted to long, harsh winters. Fish, particularly herring and cod, formed a major part of the diet and were preserved through drying, smoking, and salting. The technique of making stockfish, dried cod, became a major industry that supplied protein to much of medieval Europe. Dairy products were also important, with techniques for making long-lasting cheeses and fermented dairy products that could survive winter storage. Germanic regions developed sophisticated brewing traditions that made ale and beer central to daily food culture. The hop-flavored beer that became standard in Germanic regions was both more flavorful and longer-lasting than the unhopped Ales common elsewhere. Germanic food culture also emphasized preserved meats, particularly various forms of sausages and smoked meats that could provide protein throughout the winter months. The shorter growing seasons in Northern Europe led to intensive agricultural practices designed to maximize yields during the available growing time. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots became particularly important as they could be stored through winter. Cabbages were often fermented into sauerkraut, providing essential vitamins during the months when fresh vegetables were unavailable. Northern European cooking techniques emphasized hearty, warming foods suitable for cold climates. Stews, roasts, and thick porridges were common, often cooked in large pots over open fires. The cuisine was characterized by substantial, filling dishes rather than the more delicate preparations found in warmer regions. Mediterranean food culture. Medieval Mediterranean food culture retained stronger connections to classical Roman traditions and benefited from warmer climates that supported more diverse agricultural production. The regions around the Mediterranean Sea, southern France, Italy, Spain, and the eastern Mediterranean, developed food cultures that emphasized fresh ingredients, olive oil, wine, and a greater variety of fruits and vegetables. Italy, fragmented into numerous city-states and regional powers, developed highly localized food cultures that reflected both local agricultural conditions and trade connections. Northern Italian cities like Venice and Genoa had access to spices and exotic ingredients through their extensive trade networks, leading to more elaborate and varied cuisine among the wealthy. Southern Italy and Sicily, influenced by Arab rule and continued connections to North African and Middle Eastern trade, incorporated spices and cooking techniques that were rare elsewhere in Europe. The use of olive oil rather than animal fats for cooking was a distinctive characteristic of Mediterranean cuisine that had both practical and cultural significance. Olive oil was better suited to the warm climate, kept better than animal fats, and was acceptable during Christian fast periods when animal products were prohibited. The production of olive oil became a major agricultural activity throughout the Mediterranean basin. Wine culture was more developed in Mediterranean regions, with vineyard cultivation extending back to Roman times and continuing throughout the medieval period. Wine was consumed daily by all social classes and was often safer to drink than water in urban areas. Different regions developed distinctive wine-making traditions, and the quality of local wines became a matter of regional pride and economic importance. The Mediterranean climate supported the cultivation of fruits that were rare or impossible to grow in northern Europe. Citrus fruits, figs, dates, grapes, and various tree nuts were regularly available and formed important parts of the diet. These fruits were also preserved through drying and could be exported to northern markets, creating trade networks that connected Mediterranean producers with consumers throughout Europe. Seafood was more prominent in Mediterranean diets due to extensive coastlines and well-developed fishing industries. Different regions specialized in different types of seafood and preservation techniques. The development of techniques for preserving fish in salt, particularly tuna and sardines, created products that could be traded widely and provided protein during fasting periods. Pasta, which would later become synonymous with Italian cuisine, began to develop during the medieval period, though it did not yet hold the central position it would achieve in later centuries. Early pasta was often a luxury item, made with expensive white flour and sometimes combined with expensive ingredients like cheese and spices. Eastern European food culture. Eastern European food culture during the medieval period was influenced by Byzantine traditions, Slavic agricultural practices, and periodic contact with nomadic peoples from the steppes. The food habits of regions that would later become Russia, Poland, Hungary, and the Balkans reflected these diverse influences while adapting to local environmental conditions. Byzantine influence was particularly strong in southeastern Europe, where Orthodox Christian fasting traditions created dietary patterns different from those in Western Europe. The Byzantine calendar included more and stricter fasting periods, which influenced the development of plant-based cuisine and fish consumption. The use of olive oil was common in areas under Byzantine influence, while regions farther north relied more on animal fats. Slavic agricultural traditions emphasized grains like rye, barley, and millet, which were better adapted to the continental climate than wheat. Buckwheat, introduced from Asia, became an important crop in some regions. Root vegetables, cabbages, and onions were dietary staples, often preserved through fermentation techniques that created foods like sauerkraut and pickled vegetables. The influence of nomadic peoples, particularly in the Hungarian plain and southern Russian steppes, introduced elements of pastoral food culture including increased emphasis on dairy products and preserved meats. The technique of making fermented mare's milk, though never widespread, was known in some eastern regions through contact with nomadic groups. Eastern European brewing traditions developed distinctive characteristics, including the use of honey to make mead, which was particularly important in regions with extensive forests that supported beekeeping. Kvass, a fermented beverage made from bread, became a common drink in Slavic regions and represented an alternative to the ale and beer traditions of Western Europe. The preservation of food through smoking was highly developed in Eastern Europe, particularly for fish and meats. The abundance of forests provided wood for smoking, and the technique was used to preserve both fish from rivers and lakes and meat from domesticated and wild animals. Hunting and gathering remained important components of the diet in Eastern European regions where forests were extensive and population density was lower than in Western Europe. Knowledge of edible wild plants, mushrooms, and berries was more widespread and remained important longer than in more densely settled regions. The gradual expansion of trade networks during the medieval period brought exotic ingredients to European tables and profoundly influenced food culture across the continent. The spice trade, in particular, became a driving force in European exploration and economic development while transforming the cuisine of the wealthy classes. Spices arrived in Europe through multiple trade routes, each with its own characteristics and challenges. The overland routes through Asia brought spices from India, Southeast Asia, and China through Constantinople and Venice to European markets. These routes were expensive and dangerous, making spices extremely valuable luxury items. The maritime routes around Africa, developed later in the medieval period, eventually provided alternative access to Asian spices. Black pepper was perhaps the most important spice in medieval European cuisine, valued not only for its flavor but for its preservative properties and supposed medicinal benefits. Pepper was so valuable that it was sometimes used as currency, and the phrase, peppercorn rent, reflected its monetary value. Other important spices included cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger, each commanding high prices and being used sparingly even by the wealthy. The use of spices in medieval cuisine served multiple purposes beyond simple flavoring. Many spices were believed to have medicinal properties and were used to balance the humors according to medieval medical theory. Spices also helped preserve food and mask the flavors of meat that might not be completely fresh. The liberal use of spices in cooking became a sign of wealth and sophistication. Sugar, imported from the Middle East and later from Mediterranean islands like Cyprus and Sicily, gradually began to supplement honey as a sweetening agent. Sugar was extremely expensive and was used more as a medicine and luxury ingredient than as a basic cooking component. The wealthy might serve elaborate sugar sculptures at banquets, and sugar-coated spices were popular as both food and medicine. Salt trade was equally important but different in character from the spice trade. Salt was essential for food preservation and was needed in large quantities by all social classes. Salt production centers, whether along seacoasts or at inland salt deposits, became important economic centers. The control of salt trade routes was a source of political and economic power throughout the medieval period. The importation of exotic foods and ingredients created new social distinctions and cultural practices. The ability to serve spiced and sweetened foods became a mark of social status, leading to competitive display among the wealthy. Recipe collections began to appear that emphasized the use of expensive imported ingredients, creating a literature of luxury cuisine that contrasted with the simple, local food traditions of earlier periods. Medieval eating patterns differed significantly from modern meal structures and varied considerably based on social class, occupation, season, and regional customs. The evolution of meal timing and structure throughout the medieval period reflects changing agricultural practices, religious influences, and social conventions that gradually established patterns recognizable in later European food culture. In the early medieval period, most people ate two main meals per day: dinner, prandium, in the late morning or early afternoon, and supper, cena, in the early evening. This pattern reflected agricultural work schedules and the practical limitations of food preparation and preservation. The timing of meals was often determined by the availability of daylight, as candles and other forms of artificial lighting were expensive and used sparingly. The Church's influence on daily eating patterns was substantial, with religious services and prayer times affecting when meals could be consumed. The canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, provided a structure for the day that influenced meal timing, particularly in monastic communities but also in secular society where church bells marked the passage of time. By the later medieval period, The wealthy classes began to adopt a three-meal pattern that included a morning meal, breakfast, dinner at midday, and supper in the evening. This change reflected both increasing prosperity and the influence of urban life where artificial lighting and different work patterns made more flexible meal timing possible. Breakfast, when consumed, was typically a light meal consisting of bread, ale, or wine, and perhaps some cheese or cold meat. The concept of breaking the night's fast was understood, but elaborate morning meals were generally associated with the wealthy or with special circumstances such as travel or heavy labor. Many people, particularly the poor, might begin their day with just bread and ale. Dinner was the main meal of the day for all social classes, though its timing and elaborateness varied considerably. Among peasants, dinner might consist of bread, pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, ale, and whatever other foods were available. For the wealthy, dinner could be an elaborate affair with multiple courses, extensive service, and considerable ceremony. Supper was typically lighter than dinner and might consist of bread, cheese, cold meat, and ale or wine. The timing of supper was often determined by the end of the working day and the availability of daylight for food preparation. In winter months, when daylight hours were limited, supper might be very early by modern standards. The rhythm of eating was also influenced by agricultural seasons and food availability. Harvest time might bring temporary abundance and changes in meal patterns, while winter months often required careful rationing of stored foods. Religious seasons, particularly Lent and other fasting periods, dramatically altered eating patterns for observant Christians. Bread held a central position in medieval diet across all social classes, though the quality, type, and quantity varied dramatically based on economic status and regional grain production. The phrase, daily bread, reflected both the spiritual and practical importance of bread in medieval life, and the availability and quality of bread served as indicators of both individual prosperity and general economic conditions. The production of bread was a complex process that required significant skill and resources. Grain needed to be ground into flour, which required access to mills powered by water or wind. The construction and maintenance of mills required substantial capital investment, and mill rights were often controlled by feudal lords who charged peasants for grinding their grain. Different types of grain produced different qualities of bread, creating a hierarchy of bread types that reflected social stratification. White bread made from wheat flour was the most prestigious and expensive, consumed regularly only by the wealthy. Brown bread made from rye or barley was more common among the middle classes, while the poor often consumed bread made from mixtures of grains, sometimes including peas, beans, or other additives to stretch the flour. The color and texture of bread became important indicators of social status. White bread required more refined flour and more skill to produce, making it expensive and prestigious. Darker breads were associated with lower social status, though they were often more nutritious than refined white bread. During times of scarcity, bread might include various additives or substitutes that further marked it as food for the desperate. Urban bread production became increasingly specialized during the medieval period, with professional bakers forming guilds that regulated the trade. These guilds established standards for ingredients, pricing, and quality, and they often played important roles in urban politics and economics. The regulation of bread quality and pricing was considered essential for maintaining public order, as bread shortages or poor quality could lead to civil unrest. The baking process itself was labor-intensive and required considerable skill. Professional bakers needed to maintain sourdough starters, manage fermentation times, and control oven temperatures to produce consistent results. The communal ovens used in many communities represented significant capital investments and were often owned by lords or religious institutions who charged fees for their use. Bread consumption varied seasonally, with the quality and availability changing based on the success of grain harvests. The period between the exhaustion of old grain stores and the availability of new harvest grain, sometimes called the hunger gap, was particularly challenging and might force communities to consume bread made from inferior or adulterated flour. The symbolic importance of bread extended beyond its nutritional value. Bread was central to Christian liturgy as the substance of the Eucharist, and this religious significance influenced attitudes toward bread production and consumption. The sharing of bread created social bonds, and offering bread to guests was an important aspect of hospitality customs throughout medieval Europe. Regional variations in bread reflected local grain production, milling technologies, and cultural preferences. Mediterranean regions might produce bread using olive oil, while Northern European breads often incorporated dairy products. The shape, size, and baking methods of bread varied considerably, creating distinctive regional traditions that persisted for centuries. Pottage and one-pot cooking. Pottage, a thick stew-like dish made from grains, vegetables, and sometimes small amounts of meat, represented one of the most common forms of food preparation across medieval Europe. This cooking method was particularly important for lower social classes who needed to create nutritious, filling meals from limited and often poor-quality ingredients. The basic preparation of pottage involved boiling grains such as oats, barley, or rye in water or broth until they formed a thick, porridge-like consistency. Vegetables like onions, leeks, cabbage, and turnips were commonly added, along with herbs for flavoring. When available, small amounts of meat, bacon fat, or dairy products might enrich the dish, but pottage could also serve as a complete meal using only plant-based ingredients. One-pot cooking was practical for several reasons that made it ideal for medieval conditions. It required only a single cooking vessel, conserving fuel and cookware. The long, slow cooking process made tough cuts of meat tender and allowed maximum extraction of nutrition from bones and vegetable scraps. The cooking method also made efficient use of limited ingredients by combining them into filling, nutritious meals. The preparation of pottage was typically the responsibility of women, and knowledge of how to create tasty, nutritious pottage from available ingredients was passed down through generations. Seasonal variations kept the dish from becoming monotonous, with different vegetables, herbs, and occasional protein sources changing the character of the meal throughout the year. Different regions developed distinctive pottage traditions based on local ingredients and preferences. French pot au feu, English peas porridge, and Germanic versions with cabbage and root vegetables all represented regional adaptations of the basic one-pot cooking concept. These dishes often became associated with regional identity and local food culture. The social significance of pottage extended beyond simple sustenance. Sharing a pot of pottage created community bonds, as families and sometimes neighbors might contribute ingredients to a common pot. The phrase, "what's in the pot," became a common way of describing whatever food was available, reflecting the central role of pot cooking in daily meal preparation. Pottage also served important functions during times of scarcity, as it could be stretched with water to feed more people and could incorporate foraged foods, scraps, and ingredients that might not be palatable on their own. The ability to create satisfying meals from minimal ingredients made pottage an essential survival food throughout the medieval period. Alcoholic beverages played crucial roles in medieval diet and culture, serving not only as sources of nutrition and calories but also as safer alternatives to water, which was often contaminated in urban areas. The production and consumption of ale, beer, and wine became central aspects of medieval food culture, with different beverages associated with particular regions, social classes, and occasions. Ale production was widespread throughout Northern Europe and was often handled at the household level, particularly by women who were known as alewives. The brewing process involved malting grains, usually barley, mashing them with hot water, and fermenting the resulting liquid with naturally occurring yeasts. The alcoholic content was typically lower than modern beer, and ale needed to be consumed relatively quickly as it did not keep well without refrigeration. The transition from ale to hopped beer represented one of the significant technological changes in medieval beverage production. Hops, introduced from continental Europe to England and other regions during the later medieval period, served both as a flavoring agent and as a natural preservative that extended the shelf life of the beverage. This innovation allowed for commercial beer production on a larger scale and created new trade opportunities. Wine production was concentrated in regions with suitable climates and soil conditions, primarily in France, Italy, Spain, and parts of Germany. The medieval wine industry built upon Roman traditions but developed new techniques for cultivation, fermentation, and storage. Monastic communities played particularly important roles in wine production, with many monasteries becoming renowned for their wines and contributing to viticultural knowledge. The social hierarchy was reflected in beverage consumption patterns. Fine wines were associated with nobility and wealthy merchants, while common wine, ale, and small beer were consumed by lower social classes. The quality and origin of wine served at meals indicated the host's social status and wealth, making wine selection an important aspect of social display. Medieval beverages were often consumed at different strengths for different purposes. Small beer, or small ale, with very low alcohol content might be consumed by children and throughout the day as a thirst quencher. Stronger versions were reserved for evening consumption and special occasions. Wine was sometimes diluted with water, following classical traditions and making expensive wines stretch further. The economics of beverage production created important industries and trade networks. Commercial brewers and wine merchants became significant figures in medieval urban economies. The taxation of alcoholic beverages provided important revenue for governments, and the regulation of their production and sale was a constant concern for authorities. Religious attitudes toward alcoholic beverages were complex, with wine having sacred significance in Christian liturgy while excessive drinking was condemned as the sin of gluttony. Monastic rules typically allowed moderate consumption of wine or ale while prohibiting drunkenness. Different religious orders had varying approaches to alcohol production and consumption. Seasonal eating patterns. Medieval food culture was fundamentally shaped by seasonal rhythms that determined food availability, preservation needs, and eating patterns. Understanding these seasonal variations is essential to comprehending how medieval people experienced food throughout the year and how they adapted their diets to natural cycles and agricultural limitations. Spring represented a time of renewal and scarcity, as stored winter foods were often exhausted before new crops could be harvested. This period, sometimes called the Hunger Gap, required careful rationing of remaining stores and increased reliance on early spring foods like wild greens, herbs, and whatever could be foraged or gathered. Young animals born in spring provided some protein, but breeding stock was too valuable to slaughter except in extreme circumstances. The spring diet often included foods that would be considered unusual or undesirable at other times of year. Tree bark, particularly from birch trees, might be ground and mixed with remaining grain to make bread. Wild plants like nettles, dandelion greens, and various herbs provided essential vitamins after a winter of stored foods. Early spring vegetables like leeks and onions from household gardens supplemented the limited diet. Summer brought abundance and variety as gardens produced fresh vegetables and herbs, fruit trees ripened, and dairy production increased as animals had access to rich pasture. This was a time for rebuilding strength after the privations of late winter and spring, and for beginning the preservation activities that would provide food for the following winter. Fresh fruits and vegetables were consumed eagerly during summer months, providing essential vitamins and nutrients that were difficult to obtain from preserved foods. Soft fruits like berries were eaten fresh or made into preserves when possible. Leafy vegetables, herbs, and early root vegetables provided variety and nutrition after months of limited diet. Autumn was the season of harvest and preservation, when communities engaged in intensive activity to secure food supplies for winter. Grain harvests determined the prosperity of the coming year, while the slaughter of animals that could not be fed through winter provided protein that needed to be preserved through smoking, salting, or other methods. The autumn slaughter was a major event in rural communities, with families carefully calculating which animals could be kept alive through winter and which needed to be processed. This created temporary abundance of fresh meat, but also required intensive work to preserve as much as possible for later consumption. Winter eating patterns reflected the limitations of preservation technology and storage capacity. Diets became more monotonous, relying heavily on stored grains, preserved meats, and vegetables that could be kept in root cellars or other storage areas. The quality of food often deteriorated as winter progressed, with stored grains becoming moldy, preserved meats developing strong flavors, and vegetables losing nutritional value. Winter cooking methods adapted to available ingredients and heating needs. Long-simmered stews and pottages made efficient use of preserved ingredients while providing warming, substantial meals. The practice of keeping a pot constantly simmering over the fire allowed families to add ingredients as they became available and provided hot food throughout cold months. Religious observances often aligned with seasonal eating patterns, with major fasting periods like Lent occurring during times when food stores were naturally low. Feast days frequently coincided with harvest periods or times of natural abundance, creating cultural celebrations that reinforced seasonal rhythms. Medieval kitchens varied dramatically in scale and sophistication, from the simple hearths of peasant cottages to the elaborate multi-room complexes of great castles and monasteries. The architecture and equipment of medieval kitchens reflected both practical needs and social status, while technological innovations gradually improved cooking efficiency and food safety throughout the period. Peasant kitchens were typically integrated into the main living space of the house, with a central hearth serving multiple functions including cooking, heating, and light. These simple arrangements consisted of a fire pit or raised hearth with a chimney or smoke hole for ventilation. Cooking was done over open flames using iron pots suspended from hooks or placed on trivets. The limited space and equipment required efficient use of every cooking vessel and tool. The hearth in peasant homes was the center of domestic life, serving not only for cooking but as a gathering place for the family and a workspace for various household activities. Women managed the hearth and developed considerable skill in maintaining fires, regulating heat, and cooking multiple dishes with limited equipment. The knowledge required to manage a medieval hearth effectively was substantial and was passed down through generations of women. Noble kitchens, in contrast, were often separate buildings or dedicated rooms designed to handle large-scale food preparation for substantial households and frequent guests. These kitchens might include multiple hearths, specialized ovens, extensive storage areas, and workspaces for different aspects of food preparation. The separation of kitchens from living areas helped reduce fire danger and cooking odors while providing space for the extensive equipment and staff required for elaborate meal preparation. Great kitchen complexes in castles and large monasteries represented the most sophisticated food preparation facilities of the medieval world. These might include multiple cooking hearths, bread ovens, storage cellars, pantries, buttery, and specialized areas for different types of food preparation. The kitchen complex at Glastonbury Abbey, for example, included multiple buildings and could handle food preparation for hundreds of people. Cooking equipment in medieval kitchens included a variety of specialized tools and vessels designed for different cooking methods. Iron cauldrons of various sizes served for boiling and stewing, while spits allowed for roasting meat over open flames. Griddles provided flat surfaces for cooking bread and pancakes, and specialized vessels like fish kettles and pudding cloths enabled particular cooking techniques. The development of chimney technology during the 12th and 13th centuries represented a significant advancement in kitchen architecture. Improved ventilation systems allowed for better heat control, reduced smoke in cooking areas, and decreased fire danger. The ability to create controlled drafts enabled more sophisticated cooking techniques and made kitchen work more pleasant and efficient. Storage and preservation equipment formed essential components of medieval kitchens. Root cellars, pantries, and specialized storage areas maintained optimal conditions for different types of food. Salt boxes, spice cabinets, and other specialized storage solutions protected valuable ingredients from moisture, pests, and contamination. Water supply and waste management were crucial aspects of kitchen design, particularly in larger establishments. Wells, cisterns, or piped water systems provided clean water for cooking and cleaning, while drainage systems handled waste water and food scraps. The management of kitchen waste was important both for sanitation and for feeding animals or composting. Cooking methods and techniques. Medieval cooking methods were constrained by available technology but demonstrated remarkable ingenuity in creating varied and flavorful dishes using relatively simple equipment. The mastery of fire management, understanding of ingredient interactions, and development of preservation techniques created a sophisticated cooking culture that maximized flavor and nutrition from available ingredients. Boiling was perhaps the most common cooking method, as it could be accomplished with simple equipment and made efficient use of fuel. Large cauldrons suspended over fires allowed cooks to prepare substantial quantities of food, while smaller vessels enabled more delicate preparations. The technique of simmering, maintaining temperatures just below boiling, was well understood and used for preparations that required gentle cooking. Roasting over open flames was associated with higher social status and special occasions, as it required better cuts of meat and more fuel than other cooking methods. The technique involved mounting meat on spits that were turned manually to ensure even cooking. Spit roasting required considerable skill to maintain proper temperatures and timing, and specialized servants called spit boys were often employed for this purpose in wealthy households. Baking required access to ovens, which were expensive to build and maintain. Many communities shared communal ovens, often located in mills or owned by feudal lords who charged fees for their use. The thermal mass of stone or brick ovens retained heat for extended periods, allowing bakers to cook multiple batches of bread or other baked goods from a single firing. Frying was less common than in later periods due to the expense of cooking fats and oils, but it was used for special preparations and in regions where olive oil was readily available. Pan frying in small amounts of fat allowed for quick cooking of delicate ingredients and created different textures and flavors than other cooking methods. Smoking and drying were crucial preservation techniques that also served as cooking methods. The controlled application of smoke from various woods imparted distinctive flavors while preserving meat and fish for extended periods. Different types of wood produced different flavor profiles, and the mastery of smoking techniques was essential knowledge for food preservation. Fermentation processes were widely understood and used for both food preparation and preservation. The fermentation of dairy products created cheeses and other preserved foods, while vegetable fermentation produced foods like sauerkraut that could be stored through winter months. Bread leavening, alcoholic beverage production, and various preservation techniques all relied on controlled fermentation. Braising and stewing techniques combined multiple cooking methods to create complex, flavorful dishes from tough or inexpensive ingredients. The technique involved initial browning followed by slow cooking in liquid, which broke down tough fibers and created rich, satisfying meals. These methods were particularly important for making use of less desirable cuts of meat and for creating substantial dishes from limited ingredients. The understanding of temperature control was sophisticated despite the lack of precise measuring instruments. Experienced cooks could judge oven temperatures by placing their hands inside, estimate cooking times by observation, and adjust heat by manipulating fuel and airflow. This experiential knowledge required years to develop and represented valuable expertise in medieval food preparation. Seasoning and flavoring techniques demonstrated considerable sophistication in combining ingredients to create complex tastes. The use of herbs, spices, and other flavoring agents was carefully balanced to enhance rather than mask the flavors of primary ingredients. Medieval cooks understood how different seasonings interacted and how cooking methods affected flavoring. Preservation and storage technologies. Food preservation was essential for survival in medieval Europe, where seasonal agricultural production needed to provide nutrition throughout the year. The development and refinement of preservation techniques represented crucial technological knowledge that determined food security for individuals and communities. Salt preservation was perhaps the most important and widely used preservation method, employed for meat, fish, and some vegetables. The technique required understanding of salt types, curing times, and storage conditions to produce safe, flavorful preserved foods. Different grades of salt were used for different purposes, with fine salt preferred for delicate preparations and coarse salt used for heavy preservation work. The salt curing process involved covering food with salt or immersing it in strong salt solutions, brine, that drew out moisture and created conditions hostile to bacterial growth. Proper salt preservation required careful attention to salt-to-food ratios, curing times, and storage conditions. Successfully preserved foods could last for months or even years when properly handled. Smoking combined flavor enhancement with preservation by exposing foods to controlled smoke from burning wood. Different types of wood produced different flavors, and the smoking process could be adjusted for various preservation needs. Cold smoking preserved foods without cooking them, while hot smoking provided both cooking and preservation in a single process. The construction and operation of smokehouses required considerable expertise in fire management, ventilation control, and timing. Properly smoked foods developed distinctive flavors while achieving preservation that could extend storage life significantly. The technique was particularly important for fish and meat preservation in regions with abundant timber resources. Drying or dehydration was accomplished through natural air drying, solar drying, or artificial drying using heat sources. The removal of moisture prevented bacterial growth and concentrated flavors while reducing weight and volume for storage and transport. Dried foods could be reconstituted with water or consumed directly as concentrated nutrition. Fruits, vegetables, grains, and meats could all be preserved through drying, though different foods required different techniques and storage methods. Proper drying required understanding of humidity, temperature, and air circulation to prevent spoilage during the drying process. Fermentation preservation created foods that were not only preserved but also enhanced nutritionally and flavorfully. Controlled fermentation produced beneficial bacteria that prevented harmful spoilage while creating distinctive tastes and textures. Fermented dairy products, vegetables, and grain-based foods all played important roles in medieval diets. The management of fermentation required understanding of timing, temperature, and ingredient ratios to produce consistent, safe results. Fermentation containers, starter cultures, and storage conditions all affected the success of fermentation processes. Knowledge of fermentation was often passed down through families and communities as closely guarded expertise. Root cellars and other underground storage areas provided controlled environments for preserving fresh foods through winter months. These storage areas maintained relatively constant cool temperatures and proper humidity levels for different types of foods. The construction of effective storage areas required understanding of drainage, ventilation, and insulation principles. Different foods required different storage conditions, leading to specialized storage areas within larger storage complexes. Grain storage needed to be dry and protected from rodents, while root vegetables required cool, humid conditions. Dairy products needed cool temperatures but different humidity levels than vegetables. Fat preservation involved covering foods with rendered animal fats that solidified and created airtight seals preventing spoilage. This technique was particularly useful for preserving cooked meats and was often combined with other preservation methods for enhanced effectiveness. Pickling and acidic preservation used vinegar or other acidic solutions to create environments hostile to bacterial growth while adding distinctive flavors. Pickled vegetables, fruits, and sometimes meats could be stored for extended periods and provided variety in winter diets. Medieval understanding of nutrition and health was based primarily on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors, as transmitted through Roman and Islamic medical traditions. This system, which dominated European medical thought throughout the medieval period, viewed health as a balance between the four bodily humors: blood, hot and moist; phlegm, cold and moist; yellow bile, hot and dry; and black bile, cold and dry. According to humoral theory, foods possessed inherent qualities of heat, cold, moisture, and dryness that could affect the body's humoral balance. Physicians and educated individuals classified foods according to these qualities and prescribed specific diets to restore humoral equilibrium in sick individuals. This system created a sophisticated, if scientifically inaccurate, framework for understanding the relationship between diet and health. Hot foods were believed to include spices, wine, meat, and foods that grew in sunny conditions, while cold foods included most vegetables, fruits, fish, and dairy products. Moist foods included those with high water content, while dry foods included aged cheeses, nuts, and dried preparations. The ideal diet was thought to balance these qualities according to individual constitution and current health status. Individual temperaments were also classified according to humoral theory, with people identified as sanguine, hot and moist; phlegmatic, cold and moist; choleric, hot and dry; or melancholic, cold and dry. Dietary recommendations were tailored to individual temperaments, with hot-tempered individuals advised to consume cooling foods and cold-natured people encouraged to eat warming foods. Seasonal dietary adjustments were considered essential for maintaining health, as the changing seasons were believed to affect bodily humors. Spring required foods that would balance the increasing heat and moisture, while winter called for warming, drying foods to counteract cold and wet conditions. These seasonal recommendations often aligned with natural food availability, creating practical dietary guidance. The timing of food consumption was also considered important for health, with different foods recommended for different times of day based on their perceived effects on digestion and humoral balance. Heavy, warming foods might be recommended for morning consumption, while lighter, cooling foods were considered appropriate for evening meals. Medieval medical practitioners recognized the importance of digestion for overall health and developed detailed theories about how different foods affected digestive processes. Foods were classified as easy or difficult to digest, and meal composition was planned to optimize digestive efficiency. The concept of concoction, the body's ability to transform food into usable nutrition, was central to medieval nutritional thought. The preparation and combination of foods were believed to affect their nutritional and medicinal properties. Cooking methods could alter the humoral qualities of foods, making cold foods warmer or dry foods moister. Spices and herbs were often added not only for flavor but to balance the humoral qualities of dishes and aid digestion. Water quality and its effects on health were well understood, leading to preferences for alcoholic beverages in areas where water supplies were questionable. However, the humoral system also classified different types of water according to their perceived health effects, with some sources considered particularly beneficial for certain conditions. Food as medicine, medieval dietary therapy. The medieval period saw little distinction between food and medicine, with dietary therapy representing one of the primary medical interventions available to practitioners. This approach, based on humoral theory and inherited from classical medical traditions, created sophisticated systems for using food to prevent and treat illness. Medical treatises of the period contained extensive information about the therapeutic properties of various foods, often providing more detail about dietary interventions than about other medical treatments. Physicians were expected to be knowledgeable about food properties and skilled in prescribing appropriate diets for different conditions and constitutions. Specific foods were prescribed for particular ailments based on their perceived humoral qualities and their supposed effects on bodily systems. For example, individuals suffering from fever, considered a hot condition, might be prescribed cooling foods like lettuce, cucumbers, and diluted wine, while those with cold conditions might receive warming spices, wine, and meat. Digestive ailments received particular attention in medieval dietary therapy, as proper digestion was considered fundamental to health. Foods that were easy to digest, such as soft-boiled eggs, light broths, and properly prepared grains, were prescribed for individuals with weak digestion. Conversely, those with strong constitutions might be encouraged to consume more substantial, difficult-to-digest foods. The preparation of medicinal foods required considerable knowledge and skill, as cooking methods were believed to alter therapeutic properties. Broths made from specific meats or vegetables might be prescribed for particular conditions, with detailed instructions about cooking times, seasonings, and serving temperatures. Fasting was considered an important therapeutic intervention, believed to help restore humoral balance by allowing the body to clear accumulated toxins and excess humors. Different types of fasts were prescribed for different conditions, ranging from complete abstinence from food to restrictions on particular types of foods or eating patterns. Spices and herbs occupied a central position in medieval dietary therapy, valued both for their intense flavors and their supposed medicinal properties. Many spices were considered hot and dry in humoral terms, making them useful for treating cold, wet conditions. The high cost of spices made them primarily available to the wealthy, creating associations between expensive seasonings and sophisticated medical treatment. The regulation of eating patterns, including meal timing, portion sizes, and food combinations, was considered as important as food selection for therapeutic purposes. Patients might be advised to eat small, frequent meals or to avoid certain food combinations that were believed to create harmful interactions within the body. Individual dietary prescriptions took into account not only current illness but also personal constitution, age, occupation, and lifestyle factors. A young, physically active person might receive different dietary recommendations than an elderly, sedentary individual, even when treating similar conditions. The success or failure of dietary therapy was judged by observable changes in the patient's condition, including alterations in complexion, energy level, digestive function, and other physical signs. This empirical approach, while based on incorrect theoretical foundations, sometimes produced beneficial results through practical experience and observation. The medieval practice of alternating between fasting and feasting served both religious and medical purposes, creating rhythms of dietary restriction and abundance that were believed to benefit both spiritual and physical health. These practices were deeply embedded in Christian theology while also aligning with medical theories about the benefits of periodic dietary modification. Religious fasting was prescribed by the Church as a form of spiritual discipline that helped believers focus on spiritual rather than physical needs. The various fasting periods throughout the liturgical year created a complex calendar of dietary restrictions that affected all levels of medieval society, though with different levels of strictness and enforcement. The medical justification for periodic fasting was based on humoral theory, which suggested that regular fasting helped clear the body of accumulated toxins and restored proper humoral balance. Physicians often recommended fasting as a treatment for various ailments and as a preventive measure for maintaining health. Lenten fasting represented the most extensive and widely observed dietary restriction, requiring abstinence from meat, dairy products, and eggs for 40 days. This practice created significant changes in food production, distribution, and consumption patterns, as communities needed to provide alternative sources of protein and nutrition during the fasting period. The physiological effects of extended fasting were observed and discussed by medieval medical practitioners, who noted both beneficial and potentially harmful consequences. Proper management of fasting periods required understanding of individual constitution and health status to prevent weakening or illness. Feast days provided approved occasions for abundant consumption, often following periods of restriction. These celebrations served important social and cultural functions while also providing opportunities to restore physical strength after fasting periods. The contrast between fasting and feasting created appreciation for abundance while reinforcing spiritual discipline. The preparation of foods appropriate for fasting periods required considerable culinary knowledge and creativity. Cooks needed to create satisfying, nutritious meals without prohibited ingredients, leading to the development of specialized fasting recipes and cooking techniques. Fish cookery, in particular, became highly sophisticated due to its importance during fasting periods. Different social classes experienced fasting differently, with the wealthy able to substitute expensive permitted foods for prohibited items, while the poor might simply reduce their overall food intake. This created different health consequences and experiences of fasting across social hierarchies. The enforcement and interpretation of fasting rules varied by region, religious order, and individual circumstances. Pregnant women, the elderly, the sick, and those engaged in heavy physical labor might receive dispensations or modified fasting requirements. These exceptions reflected practical understanding of nutritional needs while maintaining religious observance. Breaking fast periods required careful attention to avoid digestive upset from suddenly returning to rich foods after periods of restriction. Medieval medical knowledge recognized the importance of gradually transitioning between fasting and normal eating patterns to maintain health. The psychological and social aspects of fasting and feasting were well understood, with recognition that these practices affected mood, social relationships, and community cohesion. The shared experience of fasting created community bonds while feast days provided occasions for celebration and social interaction. Specific foods and their perceived properties. Medieval medical and nutritional thought assigned specific properties and therapeutic effects to individual foods, creating a detailed pharmacopoeia of dietary interventions. These beliefs, while not scientifically accurate by modern standards, represented sophisticated attempts to understand and systematize the relationship between food and health. Bread, the staple of medieval diet, was generally considered healthful and easily digestible, though different types of bread were believed to have different properties. White wheat bread was considered the most healthful and appropriate for the sick and wealthy, while darker breads made from other grains were thought to be more suitable for those engaged in heavy labor. Meat was classified according to the animal's characteristics and living conditions. Beef was considered substantial and strengthening but potentially difficult to digest. Pork was thought to be particularly nutritious but also potentially harmful if not properly prepared. Poultry was generally considered lighter and more easily digestible, making it appropriate for the sick and elderly. Game meats were often considered superior to domestic animals, as wild animals were thought to have purer, more concentrated nutritional properties due to their natural diet and active lifestyle. Venison was particularly prized for its supposed medicinal qualities and was often prescribed for individuals recovering from illness. Fish occupied a complex position in medieval dietary thought, with different species assigned different properties. River fish were often preferred over sea fish for their supposed purity, while certain fish were believed to have specific therapeutic effects. The preparation of fish was considered crucial for maintaining their beneficial properties. Dairy products were generally considered nutritious but potentially problematic for certain constitutions. Fresh milk was thought to be particularly beneficial for children and those recovering from illness, while aged cheeses were considered more suitable for healthy adults. The processing of dairy products was believed to alter their medicinal properties significantly. Fruits and vegetables were classified according to their perceived humoral qualities, with most considered cooling and moistening. Apples were generally thought to be healthful and appropriate for most people, while other fruits might be recommended or discouraged based on individual constitution and health status. Spices and herbs were prized not only for their flavors but for their intensive medicinal properties. Black pepper was thought to aid digestion and warm the stomach, while ginger was prescribed for various digestive ailments. The high cost of many spices made them primarily available as medicine for the wealthy. Alcoholic beverages were generally considered healthful in moderation, with wine particularly valued for its supposed medicinal properties. Different types of wine were thought to have different effects, and wine was often prescribed as a tonic for the elderly and sick. Beer and ale were considered more suitable for everyday consumption and for those engaged in physical labor. The preparation and combination of foods were believed to significantly alter their nutritional and medicinal properties. Cooking methods could change the humoral qualities of foods, making them more or less suitable for particular individuals or conditions. The art of proper food preparation was considered essential medical knowledge. The gradual development of commercial food markets throughout the medieval period transformed how people obtained, prepared, and consumed food across European society. This evolution from largely subsistence-based food systems to increasingly monetized and specialized food economies represented one of the most significant changes in medieval daily life. Early medieval food systems were primarily local and subsistence-based, with most people producing the majority of their own food. Trade in food products was limited to essential items like salt, or luxury goods like spices that could not be produced locally. Markets, when they existed, were typically small, local affairs focused on exchanging surplus agricultural production for necessary items that could not be produced at home. The revival of commercial activity during the High Medieval period, roughly 1000 to 1300 CE, led to the establishment of more sophisticated food markets in growing towns and cities. These markets required regulation to ensure fair dealing, quality control, and adequate supply for urban populations who could not produce their own food. Urban food markets developed complex structures that included wholesale markets where merchants could purchase large quantities of goods, retail markets where individual consumers could buy smaller amounts, and specialized markets for particular types of food. The regulation of these markets became a major concern for municipal authorities who needed to ensure adequate food supplies while preventing fraud and maintaining public order. The establishment of regular market days and annual fairs created rhythms of commercial activity that influenced food production and consumption patterns across wide regions. Farmers and food producers organized their activities around these market opportunities, while consumers adapted their food purchasing and consumption to market schedules. Quality control in medieval food markets was maintained through guild regulations, municipal oversight, and customary practices that established standards for various food products. Bakers' guilds regulated bread quality and pricing, butchers' guilds controlled meat sales, and other food trades developed their own regulatory systems to maintain standards and protect their commercial interests. The pricing of food in medieval markets reflected complex interactions between supply and demand, transportation costs, seasonal availability, and regulatory constraints. Price regulation was often attempted by authorities, particularly for essential items like bread, but market forces frequently overcame regulatory efforts. The development of food markets created new occupations and specializations within medieval society. Professional food traders, market officials, food quality inspectors, and various middlemen became important figures in urban economies. These specialists possessed knowledge about food quality, pricing, and trade networks that made them valuable intermediaries between producers and consumers. Credit and financial arrangements in food markets became increasingly sophisticated as trade volumes grew. Merchants developed systems for financing large purchases, managing seasonal payment cycles, and handling the risks associated with perishable commodities. These financial innovations supported the growth of larger-scale food trade and distribution systems. The integration of local markets into regional and international trade networks allowed for greater variety in food choices while also creating vulnerabilities to supply disruptions and price fluctuations in distant markets. Urban populations became increasingly dependent on these trade networks for their food security. The international spice trade represented one of the most significant and transformative aspects of medieval commerce, reshaping not only cuisine but also economic systems, political relationships, and cultural patterns throughout Europe and beyond. The quest for spices drove exploration, colonization, and the development of sophisticated trade networks that connected Europe with Asia and Africa. Spices arrived in medieval Europe through complex trade routes that passed through multiple intermediaries, each adding costs that made the final products extremely expensive. The overland routes through Central Asia and the Middle East were controlled by Muslim merchants and rulers who profited substantially from European demand for Asian spices. Black pepper was perhaps the most important spice in medieval European trade, valued not only for its flavor but also for its preservative properties and supposed medicinal benefits. Pepper was so valuable that it was sometimes used as currency, and the control of pepper trade routes was a source of political and economic power. Other crucial spices included cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Moluccas, nutmeg from the Banda Islands, and ginger from various Asian locations. Each of these spices commanded extremely high prices in European markets and was available only to the wealthiest segments of society. The Venice-dominated spice trade created enormous wealth for Italian city-states while also providing incentives for other European powers to seek alternative routes to Asian markets. The Portuguese exploration of sea routes around Africa and the Spanish sponsorship of Columbus's westward voyage were both motivated largely by the desire to bypass the expensive traditional spice routes. The use of spices in medieval European cuisine went beyond simple flavoring to encompass preservation, medicine, and social display. Heavily spiced foods became markers of wealth and sophistication, leading to competitive displays of spice consumption among the wealthy. The ability to serve elaborately spiced dishes at feasts demonstrated both economic power and cultural refinement. Medieval recipe collections reveal the extensive use of spices in upper-class cuisine, with some dishes calling for combinations of multiple expensive spices. The proportions used were often much heavier than modern tastes would prefer, reflecting both the preservative functions of spices and their role as status symbols. The spice trade also influenced medieval medical practice, as many spices were valued as much for their supposed therapeutic properties as for their culinary uses. Medical treatises devoted considerable attention to the proper medicinal applications of various spices, creating a parallel market for spices as pharmaceutical products. The economic impact of the spice trade extended beyond the direct costs of the products themselves to influence monetary systems, credit mechanisms, and international finance. The profits from spice trading funded banking operations, supported political activities, and provided capital for further commercial expansion. The cultural impact of the spice trade included the development of more sophisticated culinary traditions, the creation of new social customs around food consumption, and the gradual integration of European cuisine with broader international food traditions. The availability of exotic spices, even in limited quantities, began to transform European cooking from its earlier simplicity toward greater complexity and variety. The introduction and gradual expansion of sugar consumption during the medieval period represented another significant change in European food culture, though sugar remained a luxury item available only to the wealthy throughout most of the medieval era. The development of sugar production and trade created new economic opportunities while also influencing culinary traditions and social customs. Honey had been the primary sweetening agent in European cuisine since ancient times, and it continued to play an important role throughout the medieval period. Beekeeping was practiced widely, and honey was used not only for sweetening but also for preservation and for making mead. The collection of wild honey from forest hives was an important seasonal activity in many regions. Sugar cane cultivation was introduced to Europe through Islamic influence, particularly in Sicily and southern Spain, during the medieval period. However, the climate limitations of most European regions meant that sugar remained primarily an import from Middle Eastern and North African sources. The processing of sugar cane into refined sugar was a complex and expensive process that required considerable technical knowledge and equipment. Sugar refineries were substantial industrial operations that represented major capital investments. The high costs of production and transport made refined sugar extremely expensive throughout the medieval period. Sugar was initially used more as a medicine and spice than as a basic sweetening agent. Medieval medical texts described sugar as having warming and moistening properties that made it useful for treating various ailments. The high cost of sugar meant that it was often sold in small quantities by apothecaries rather than food merchants. As sugar became more available, though still expensive, it began to appear in wealthy households as a luxury ingredient in special preparations. Sugar work, the creation of decorative sculptures and elaborate presentations using sugar, became an art form associated with the most prestigious banquets and celebrations. The combination of sugar with spices created new categories of luxury foods that demonstrated wealth and sophistication. Candied fruits, spiced sugar confections, and sweetened wine preparations became popular among those who could afford them, creating new forms of culinary artistry. Other sweetening agents remained important throughout the medieval period, including various fruit-based sweeteners, tree saps like maple syrup in some regions, and concentrated grape must. These alternatives provided sweetening options for those who could not afford imported sugar while also contributing to regional culinary traditions. The gradual increase in sugar availability during the later medieval period began to influence baking and confectionery traditions, though the full impact of sugar on European cuisine would not be felt until the early modern period when colonial production made sugar more widely available. Salt trade and preservation. Salt represented one of the most crucial commodities in medieval trade, essential for food preservation, cooking, and various industrial processes. Unlike luxury items such as spices, salt was needed by all social classes in substantial quantities, making salt production and distribution fundamental to medieval economic systems. The sources of salt in medieval Europe included coastal salt pans where seawater was evaporated, inland salt springs and deposits, and rock salt mines. Different sources produced salt of varying quality and characteristics, with some types preferred for specific uses. The location of salt sources influenced settlement patterns and trade route development. Coastal salt production was particularly important in regions with suitable climate and topography for solar evaporation of seawater. The Bay of Biscay, the Mediterranean coast, and parts of the North Sea coast became major salt-producing regions. The seasonal nature of solar salt production created cycles of intensive activity followed by periods of storage and distribution. Inland salt springs, such as those at Salzburg, Hallstatt, and various locations in England and France, provided alternative sources of salt that were often of higher quality than solar-evaporated sea salt. The control of these salt sources was frequently a source of political and economic power, as rulers could tax salt production and trade. The preservation of food using salt required considerable knowledge and skill to achieve proper results. Different types of salt were preferred for different preservation tasks, and the techniques for salting meat, fish, and vegetables required understanding of proper ratios, timing, and storage conditions. Salt trade routes became major commercial arteries that connected production centers with consuming regions. The transport of salt, which was heavy and bulky relative to its value, required efficient transportation systems and created opportunities for various intermediaries and support services. The taxation of salt became an important source of government revenue throughout medieval Europe, though such taxes were often unpopular due to salt's essential nature. The collection and enforcement of salt taxes required sophisticated administrative systems and created ongoing tensions between authorities and populations. Quality control in salt trade was important both for ensuring effectiveness in food preservation and for maintaining commercial standards. Different grades of salt commanded different prices, and the ability to distinguish quality levels became important commercial knowledge. The seasonal patterns of salt production and the imperishable nature of the product created complex market dynamics involving storage, speculation, and price manipulation. Salt merchants needed to balance the costs of storage against seasonal price variations while ensuring adequate supplies for preservation seasons. Regional variations in salt availability influenced local food preservation traditions and dietary patterns. Areas with easy access to high-quality salt developed different preservation techniques and food traditions than regions where salt was expensive and difficult to obtain. Exotic foods and status display. The consumption of exotic foods served as one of the most visible markers of social status in medieval society, with the ability to obtain and serve rare, expensive, or unusual foods representing wealth, power, and cultural sophistication. The display of exotic foods at feasts and banquets was a form of conspicuous consumption that reinforced social hierarchies and political relationships. Exotic fruits were among the most prized luxury foods, with oranges, lemons, figs, dates, and pomegranates commanding high prices when they could be obtained from Mediterranean or Middle Eastern sources. These fruits were often served at the most prestigious occasions and were sometimes preserved in sugar or honey to extend their availability. Imported fish and seafood provided opportunities for exotic food display in inland regions where fresh fish was rare or unavailable. Sturgeon and other prestigious fish species were reserved for the highest social occasions, while exotic preserved fish products like caviar represented ultimate luxury items. Game birds and exotic meats offered another category of prestigious foods, with peacocks, swans, and other elaborate fowl serving both as food and as decorative elements at great feasts. The presentation of these exotic meats was often as important as their taste, with elaborate preparations designed to impress guests. The preparation and presentation of exotic foods required specialized knowledge and skills that were themselves markers of cultural sophistication. Cooks who could properly prepare exotic ingredients were valuable employees, and their expertise contributed to their employer's social status. Exotic beverages, including rare wines from distant regions and imported drinks like Eastern European mead or Middle Eastern fruit drinks, provided additional opportunities for status display. The ability to offer guests unusual or rare beverages demonstrated both wealth and cosmopolitan knowledge. The serving and consumption of exotic foods followed elaborate rituals and protocols that emphasized their rarity and value. Special serving vessels, ceremonial presentations, and detailed etiquette surrounded the consumption of these luxury items, creating theatrical experiences that reinforced their status significance. The cost of exotic foods was often so high that they represented substantial portions of household budgets even for the wealthy. The decision to purchase and serve exotic foods was thus a significant economic choice that demonstrated priorities and values as much as financial capability. The desire for exotic foods drove innovation in food preservation, transportation, and preparation techniques. Methods for extending the shelf life of rare foods, improving transport conditions, and maintaining quality over long distances were developed to support the luxury food trade. Cultural knowledge about exotic foods became a form of social capital, with education about proper preparation, service, and consumption of unusual foods marking individuals as sophisticated and worldly. This knowledge was often passed down through elite social networks and professional food service relationships. The great medieval feast represented far more than a meal. It was a complex social institution that served political, economic, religious, and cultural functions within medieval society. These elaborate events could last for days and required months of preparation, involving hundreds of participants and consuming resources equivalent to the annual income of entire villages. The organization of a great feast began with careful planning that considered the political significance of the occasion, the status of expected guests, and the resources available for the event. Major feasts were often associated with important life events such as weddings, coronations, religious festivals, or diplomatic occasions that required impressive displays of hospitality. The scale of great feasts was deliberately overwhelming, designed to demonstrate the host's power and wealth through sheer abundance. Contemporary accounts describe feasts that served thousands of guests multiple courses containing dozens of different dishes. The Feast of the Pheasant, held by Philip the Good of Burgundy in 1454, reportedly served 30 courses with elaborate entertainment between each course. Menu planning for great feasts required sophisticated knowledge of food availability, seasonal considerations, and the symbolic significance of different dishes. The selection of foods needed to balance practical concerns about feeding large numbers with the desire to create impressive displays that would be remembered and discussed long after the event. The procurement of ingredients for great feasts involved extensive networks of suppliers, hunters, farmers, and merchants who might spend months assembling the necessary provisions. Hunting parties were organized to provide game. Special orders were placed with distant suppliers for exotic ingredients, and local producers were contracted to supply basic staples in enormous quantities. Kitchen operations for great feasts required temporary expansion of normal cooking facilities, often involving the construction of additional ovens, hearths, and preparation areas. Teams of cooks, kitchen servants, and food preparers worked around the clock during the days leading up to the feast, coordinating complex timing to ensure that multiple courses could be served properly. The service of great feasts followed elaborate protocols that reinforced social hierarchies and demonstrated cultural sophistication. Different qualities of food were served to different ranks of guests, with the most honored individuals receiving the choicest portions and most elaborate preparations. The choreography of service was carefully planned to create impressive spectacles. Entertainment was an integral part of great feasts, with musicians, dancers, storytellers, and other performers providing diversions between courses. Some feasts featured elaborate theatrical productions, mock battles, or other spectacles that combined entertainment with food service in extended celebrations. The political functions of great feasts included the reinforcement of feudal relationships, the display of wealth and power to potential allies and enemies, and the creation of social bonds through shared celebration. Invitations to great feasts were political statements, and the treatment of guests conveyed important messages about relationships and status. The economic impact of great feasts extended far beyond their immediate costs, as they provided employment for numerous craftspeople, entertainers, and food service workers while stimulating demand for luxury goods and services. The reputation gained through hosting impressive feasts could have lasting economic and political benefits. The cultural significance of great feasts included their role in preserving and transmitting social traditions, creating shared memories that reinforced community identity, and providing opportunities for cultural exchange between different regions and social groups. Wedding celebrations and food traditions. Medieval wedding celebrations were among the most important occasions for elaborate food preparation and communal dining, creating traditions that combined religious significance with social celebration and family honor. These events often represented the largest and most expensive feasts that ordinary families would ever host, requiring careful planning and substantial financial investment. The scale of wedding celebrations varied dramatically based on social class, with noble weddings potentially lasting for days and involving hundreds of guests, while peasant weddings might be more modest affairs focused on community participation and traditional foods. However, all social classes recognized weddings as occasions that justified special food preparation and celebration. Traditional wedding foods often carried symbolic significance related to fertility, prosperity, and good fortune. Eggs, nuts, grain-based dishes, and honey-sweetened foods were commonly featured at wedding celebrations due to their associations with fertility and abundance. Regional traditions developed specific wedding foods that were considered essential for proper celebration. The wedding cake, while not yet in its modern form, had early medieval precedents in special breads or sweet preparations that were shared among wedding guests. The sharing of food was an important aspect of wedding ceremonies, symbolizing the community's acceptance of the new marriage and their commitment to support the couple. Community participation in wedding food preparation was common, particularly in rural areas where extended families and neighbors might contribute ingredients, labor, or specialized dishes to the celebration. This communal effort strengthened social bonds while also distributing the economic burden of providing wedding hospitality. The timing of weddings was often influenced by agricultural cycles and food availability, with many weddings scheduled for times of year when food was abundant and seasonal specialties were available. Harvest time was particularly popular for weddings, as families had recently gathered their crops and could more easily afford elaborate celebrations. Wedding feasts served important social functions beyond simple celebration, providing opportunities for families to display their prosperity, strengthen social relationships, and establish the new couple's position within the community. The quality and abundance of wedding food reflected family status and influenced community perceptions. The religious aspects of wedding celebrations influenced food choices, with some traditions requiring specific foods or avoiding others based on religious calendars or dietary restrictions. The blessing of food by clergy was often part of wedding ceremonies, connecting the celebration to broader religious traditions. Regional variations in wedding food traditions reflected local agricultural patterns, cultural influences, and historical developments. Italian wedding celebrations might feature different foods than Germanic or Celtic traditions, creating distinctive regional marriage customs that persisted for generations. The economic impact of wedding celebrations on medieval families could be substantial, with some families spending the equivalent of months or years of income on wedding feasts. This investment was justified by the social and economic benefits of creating positive impressions and strengthening community relationships. Religious festivals and food. Religious festivals provided the primary rhythm for medieval community celebrations and significantly influenced food preparation, consumption patterns, and social customs throughout the year. The church calendar created a complex series of feast days and fasting periods that shaped both individual food habits and community food traditions. Easter represented the most important Christian celebration and was associated with the end of Lenten fasting, creating opportunities for elaborate food preparation and community celebration. Traditional Easter foods often emphasized items that had been prohibited during Lent, including eggs, dairy products, and meat dishes that celebrated the end of dietary restrictions. Christmas celebrations developed distinctive food traditions that varied by region but generally emphasized abundance, special preparations, and foods that were available during winter months. The 12 days of Christmas created an extended period of celebration that required substantial food preparation and storage. Harvest festivals, while often incorporating Christian elements, maintained connections to pre-Christian agricultural celebrations and emphasized thanksgiving for successful crops and preparation for winter months. These celebrations featured seasonal foods and traditional preparations that connected communities to agricultural rhythms. Saints' days created numerous occasions for special food preparation throughout the year, with different saints associated with particular foods or food-related traditions. These celebrations provided opportunities for community gathering and cultural transmission while also supporting local food specialties and traditions. Religious processions and pilgrimages often incorporated food distribution as acts of charity and community service. The feeding of pilgrims and poor people was considered a religious duty that created opportunities for large-scale food preparation and service. Monastery festivals and religious community celebrations often featured elaborate food preparation that demonstrated both religious devotion and institutional prosperity. Monastic communities developed sophisticated food traditions that influenced broader regional food customs. The preparation of special religious foods required knowledge of appropriate ingredients, preparation methods, and symbolic significance. Different foods carried different religious meanings, and the proper preparation of religious feast foods was considered an important aspect of community religious observance. Fasting periods before major festivals created cycles of restriction and abundance that influenced food preservation, preparation, and consumption patterns. The anticipation created by fasting periods made festival foods more appreciated and meaningful to participants. Community cooperation in preparing for religious festivals strengthens social bonds while also ensuring that proper celebrations could be maintained. The sharing of resources, labor, and expertise for religious food preparation created networks of mutual support and cultural transmission. The economic impact of religious festivals on medieval communities was substantial, as these celebrations required significant expenditures on food while also providing opportunities for merchants, food producers, and craftspeople to profit from increased demand. Guild feasts and professional celebrations. Medieval craft guilds developed elaborate traditions of communal dining that served multiple functions, including professional networking, social bonding, quality control, and the display of guild prosperity and importance. These guild feasts represented important institutions within medieval urban life and created distinctive food cultures within different professional communities. Guild entrance ceremonies often involved elaborate feasts that welcomed new members while also demonstrating the prosperity and solidarity of the organization. These events required new members to contribute to the feast expenses, creating financial obligations that reinforced commitment to guild membership and standards. Annual guild celebrations typically featured elaborate meals that brought together all guild members for professional and social interaction. These events provided opportunities for the discussion of professional matters, the resolution of disputes, and the planning of future activities while also reinforcing guild identity and solidarity. The quality and elaborateness of guild feasts reflected the prosperity and status of different craft communities within medieval society. Wealthy guilds like goldsmiths or cloth merchants might host feasts rivaling those of nobility, while less prosperous crafts maintained more modest but still significant celebrations. Guild feast menus often incorporated foods related to the guild's professional activities, with bakers' guilds featuring elaborate bread displays, vintners' guilds emphasizing wine selection, and butchers' guilds showcasing meat preparation skills. These professional connections reinforced guild identity while also demonstrating technical expertise. The regulation of guild feasts was often codified in guild statutes that specified appropriate foods, behaviors, and expenditures for different occasions. These regulations reflected both practical concerns about guild finances and social concerns about maintaining appropriate standards of behavior. Guild halls often included kitchens and dining facilities specifically designed for communal meals, representing substantial investments in infrastructure that supported guild social activities. The maintenance and improvement of these facilities was an ongoing guild expense that demonstrated commitment to communal dining traditions. The social hierarchy within guilds was reflected in feast seating arrangements, food service protocols, and the distribution of choice portions to guild masters and honored members. These practices reinforced internal guild structures while providing models for appropriate social behavior. Interguild competitions sometimes extended to the elaborateness and quality of guild feasts, with different professional organizations attempting to demonstrate their prosperity and sophistication through impressive celebrations. This competition supported the development of increasingly elaborate guild food traditions. The charitable functions of guild feasts included the provision of food for guild members who had fallen on hard times, the support of guild widows and orphans, and sometimes the distribution of food to the broader community. These activities reinforced guild social responsibilities while also demonstrating community leadership. The documentation of guild feast practices provides valuable insight into medieval urban food culture, professional relationships, and social customs that might otherwise be poorly understood. Guild records often contain detailed information about food costs, menu planning, and social protocols that illuminate broader patterns of medieval dining. The Black Death, which swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, represents one of the most catastrophic events in medieval history and profoundly transformed food culture, agricultural systems, and social relationships throughout the continent. The pandemic killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population, creating dramatic changes in food production, labor relations, and consumption patterns that would influence European society for generations. The immediate impact of the plague on food systems was devastating, as the deaths of agricultural workers left fields unharvested, livestock untended, and food distribution systems disrupted. Contemporary chronicles describe crops rotting in fields and animals dying from neglect as entire communities were decimated by disease. Labor shortages created by population losses fundamentally altered agricultural relationships and food production systems. The survivors found themselves in a dramatically different economic situation, with land becoming more available while labor became scarce and valuable. This shift began to undermine the feudal system and created opportunities for social mobility that had been rare in earlier medieval society. The consolidation of land holdings following the plague deaths allowed some survivors to accumulate larger, more productive farms that could support more varied and prosperous lifestyles. Peasant families who survived often found themselves with access to better land and fewer feudal obligations, leading to improvements in diet and food security. Changes in consumption patterns following the Black Death reflected both the trauma of survival and the improved economic circumstances of many survivors. There is evidence that meat consumption increased among lower social classes, as reduced population pressure made livestock more available and affordable. Urban food systems were particularly disrupted by the plague, as cities lost substantial portions of their populations and their complex food distribution networks collapsed. The recovery of urban food markets required rebuilding trade relationships, re-establishing quality control systems, and adapting to new demographic realities. The psychological impact of the plague influenced attitudes toward food consumption and social behavior, with some survivors adopting more hedonistic approaches to eating and celebration, while others turned toward religious asceticism and dietary restriction. The awareness of mortality created by the plague experience influenced how people approached food pleasure and social dining. Regional variations in plague impact created different food culture outcomes across Europe. Areas that suffered less severe population losses maintained more traditional food systems, while regions with devastating losses experienced more dramatic transformations in agricultural organization and food consumption patterns. The long-term agricultural changes initiated by the Black Death included shifts toward more profitable crops, increased focus on livestock production, and the development of more intensive agricultural techniques on the better lands that remained in production. These changes contributed to agricultural improvements that would eventually support population recovery. Recovery from the plague's impact on food systems was gradual and uneven, with some regions taking decades to re-establish stable food production and distribution networks. The rebuilding process created opportunities for innovation and experimentation in agricultural techniques and food processing methods. The later medieval period, roughly 1300 to 1500 CE, witnessed significant innovations in agricultural techniques, crop varieties, and food processing methods that improved food security and dietary variety across European society. These developments, often driven by the demographic and economic changes following the Black Death, laid the groundwork for early modern agricultural improvements. The development of new crop rotation systems beyond the traditional three-field system allowed for more intensive land use and improved soil fertility. Some regions experimented with four-field systems that included nitrogen-fixing crops like clover, which improved soil quality while providing fodder for livestock. Selective breeding of livestock during the late medieval period produced animals that were larger, more productive, and better adapted to local conditions. Improvements in cattle breeds increased milk production and meat quality, while developments in sheep breeding enhanced both wool quality and mutton production. Agricultural tools and techniques continued to evolve throughout the late medieval period, with improvements in plow design, the development of more efficient harrows, and innovations in harvesting equipment that increased agricultural productivity and reduced labor requirements. The introduction of new crops from other regions expanded the range of foods available to medieval Europeans. Some of these crops, introduced through trade contacts or cultural exchange, provided alternative food sources that improved dietary variety and nutritional balance. Water management techniques improved significantly during the late medieval period, with more sophisticated irrigation systems, drainage projects, and mill technology that increased agricultural productivity and food processing capabilities. These improvements were particularly important in regions with challenging environmental conditions. Food preservation and processing innovations during the late medieval period included improvements in brewing techniques, advances in cheese-making technology, and the development of better methods for meat preservation. These innovations extended the shelf life of foods and created new commercial opportunities. The application of wind and water power to food processing expanded beyond grain milling to include other food preparation activities. Mills were adapted for olive oil production, wine pressing, and various forms of food processing that reduced labor requirements and improved efficiency. Market gardening techniques became more sophisticated during the late medieval period, with urban and peri-urban areas developing intensive cultivation methods that produced fresh vegetables and herbs for growing city populations. These developments supported dietary improvements and created new economic opportunities. The development of more systematic approaches to agricultural knowledge sharing, including the compilation of agricultural manuals and the transmission of best practices through monastic networks, contributed to the spread of agricultural innovations across Europe. Regional specialization in food production became more pronounced during the late medieval period, with different areas focusing on particular crops or livestock that were well suited to local conditions and market demands. This specialization improved efficiency and supported the development of inter-regional trade networks. Urban food culture and the rise of professional cooking. The growth and increasing sophistication of medieval cities during the late medieval period created new forms of food culture centered around professional food preparation, specialized food markets, and the development of distinctive urban eating habits that differed significantly from rural food traditions. Professional cooking emerged as a recognized craft during the late medieval period, with skilled cooks developing reputations for particular specialties and moving between wealthy households to provide their services. The most skilled professionals could command substantial salaries and were considered valuable additions to noble and merchant households. Cook shops and early restaurants began to appear in larger cities, providing prepared food for urban workers, travelers, and others who could not or did not wish to prepare their own meals. These establishments represented early forms of commercial food service that would eventually evolve into more sophisticated restaurant culture. The specialization of urban food trades created distinct professional communities with their own guild organizations, technical knowledge, and cultural traditions. Bakers, butchers, brewers, and other food professionals developed increasingly sophisticated techniques and business practices. Recipe literature began to emerge during the late medieval period, with manuscript collections providing detailed instructions for elaborate dishes and cooking techniques. These recipe collections were primarily associated with wealthy households but represent early examples of systematic culinary knowledge documentation. Urban food markets became increasingly sophisticated, with permanent market buildings, regulated stall assignments, and complex systems for ensuring food quality and safety. The development of these markets required substantial municipal investment and regulatory oversight. The dining customs of wealthy urban merchants began to rival those of nobility in elaborateness and sophistication, creating new forms of social competition based on culinary display rather than traditional aristocratic privilege. This competition drove innovation in cooking techniques and food presentation. Kitchen architecture in urban settings adapted to space constraints while accommodating increasingly sophisticated cooking requirements. Multi-story buildings with specialized kitchen areas, improved ventilation systems, and efficient workspace organization became more common in wealthy urban households. The development of urban food distribution systems required coordination between rural producers, urban merchants, and various intermediaries who handled storage, transportation, and quality control. These systems became increasingly complex and efficient throughout the late medieval period. Food safety and quality regulation in urban areas became more systematic during the late medieval period, with municipal authorities developing inspection systems, quality standards, and enforcement mechanisms to protect public health and maintain market confidence. The cultural exchange facilitated by urban environments contributed to the development of more cosmopolitan food traditions that incorporated influences from different regions and cultural traditions. Cities became centers for culinary innovation and the development of new food preparations and dining customs. The late medieval period witnessed the beginning of transitions that would eventually lead to early modern food culture, including changes in agricultural systems, cooking techniques, social customs, and international trade that would accelerate dramatically in subsequent centuries. The expansion of international trade during the late medieval period brought increasing quantities of exotic ingredients to European markets, making spices, sugar, and other luxury foods more widely available, though still expensive. This gradual democratization of luxury foods began to blur traditional social distinctions based on food consumption. Technological innovations in food preservation, transportation, and preparation began to accelerate during the late medieval period, setting the stage for more dramatic changes that would characterize the early modern period. Improvements in shipping, for example, made fresh foods available over greater distances. The development of more sophisticated financial instruments and commercial practices supported the expansion of food trade and the development of more complex food distribution systems. Credit systems, insurance arrangements, and standardized weights and measures facilitated larger-scale food commerce. Changes in social structure during the late medieval period, including the growth of merchant classes and the beginning of feudal system decline, created new patterns of food consumption and social dining that would continue to evolve in subsequent periods. The influence of Renaissance culture began to affect food traditions during the late medieval period, with increased attention to classical sources, artistic food presentation, and the development of more sophisticated dining etiquette and customs. Scientific and medical knowledge began to influence food culture more significantly during the late medieval period, with improved understanding of nutrition, digestion, and food safety beginning to modify traditional practices based purely on custom and tradition. The exploration activities that began in the late medieval period would eventually revolutionize European food culture through the introduction of New World crops and the development of global trade networks, though these changes would not be fully realized until the early modern period. Regional food cultures became more distinct and self-conscious during the late medieval period, as improved communications and trade made people more aware of differences in food traditions and more interested in preserving and celebrating their own distinctive practices. The development of printing technology during the very late medieval period began to facilitate the spread of culinary knowledge and food-related information, setting the stage for the more rapid diffusion of culinary innovations that would characterize later periods. The medieval period established fundamental patterns in European food culture that would influence culinary traditions, agricultural systems, and social customs for centuries to come. The complex relationship between food and social hierarchy, the development of preservation techniques, the integration of religious observance with dietary practices, and the gradual expansion of trade networks all created foundations upon which later food cultures would build. The agricultural innovations of the medieval period, from the three-field system to improvements in livestock breeding, created the productive capacity that would eventually support larger populations and more complex societies. The preservation techniques developed by medieval communities provided the knowledge base for maintaining food security in pre-industrial societies. The social customs surrounding food consumption that developed during the medieval period established patterns of hospitality, celebration, and community bonding that remained influential throughout European history. The great feasts of medieval nobility provided models for formal dining that influenced upper-class customs for generations. The integration of food with religious practice during the medieval period created traditions of fasting and feasting that shaped European cultural calendars and influenced attitudes toward consumption, moderation, and celebration. The seasonal rhythms established by medieval agricultural and religious cycles continued to influence European social life long after the specific conditions that created them had changed. The trade networks developed to supply medieval Europe with spices, salt, and other essential foods created the commercial infrastructure and knowledge that would support the age of exploration and the development of global food systems. The medieval spice trade established precedents for international food commerce that would expand dramatically in subsequent centuries. The urban food cultures that emerged during the late medieval period provided models for professional cooking, food service, and market organization that would evolve into modern food systems. The guild structures that regulated medieval food trades established principles of quality control and professional standards that influenced food regulation for centuries. The recipe literature and culinary knowledge that began to be systematized during the medieval period created the foundation for the development of more sophisticated cooking traditions and the preservation of culinary knowledge across generations. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval period established the principle that food culture reflects and reinforces social relationships, cultural values, and community identity. The elaborate food customs of medieval society demonstrated the importance of cuisine as a form of cultural expression and social organization that extends far beyond simple sustenance. The study of medieval food habits reveals a complex, sophisticated culture that adapted creatively to environmental constraints while developing rich traditions of hospitality, celebration, and community sharing. Understanding these traditions provides insight not only into medieval society but also into the historical roots of contemporary European food culture and the universal human relationship between food, society, and identity. The legacy of medieval food culture continues to influence contemporary culinary traditions, agricultural practices, and social customs throughout Europe and beyond. The seasonal rhythms, preservation techniques, regional specializations, and social customs developed during the medieval period created cultural patterns that have proven remarkably durable and continue to shape how we think about food, community, and celebration in the modern world.